Boeing's actions are extremely concerning from like a corporate governance perspective, from do they really have the safety, protocols in place?
Yeah.
That being said, I have so many friends who will ride to the airport in the back of an Uber without a seatbelt, and then they get scared to board the plane. You're on a plane with trained professionals. Tell me another mode of transportation that's perfect. There is none.
I'm Bob Safian, and I'm here with Brian Kelly, founder of travel resource The Points Guy. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here and not in an airport.
Yeah, I was wondering whether you'd be dialing in from a plane. You're always on a plane.
I try to minimize it.
Well, this summer travel season has been quite dramatic. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about was Boeing. The safety drama, concerns. You hear from friends and family and certainly media about people wary to get on planes, some avoiding Boeing aircraft. And yet at the same time, air travel volume is like at record levels. Mm-hmm. Are people really nervous? Are there things to be nervous about? Like what's that disconnect?
It's really interesting because I'm actually, I've researched the fear of flying, and it's so fascinating. 2023 was the safest year on record, 29 million flights, and not a single commercial jetliner crashed. So flying is so astronomically safe. It's mind-boggling that it appears anxiety around flying has increased, and I think there's a number of factors. One key trend is social media, and where every incident gets blown out of proportion, whereas there have probably been a lot worse incidents over time that have happened that didn't really get pickup because it wasn't filmed on camera. So I do think there's this sense like flying's more dangerous. Now, certainly Boeing's actions are extremely concerning from like a corporate governance perspective, from do they really have the safety, protocols in place? And I did recommend people to avoid the 737-9 MAX, not for safety reasons necessarily. Although if we do remember, the Boeing 737 MAX crashes, there were several of them. I was doing it more out of like consumer, because the airlines are going to ground this for who knows how many months. So if you're booked this aircraft, it's probably going to get canceled. And some people were like, you're being over the top. But lo and behold, United, Alaska, people who were booked on MAX 9 flights, they got rebooked on alternate flights that were far less appealing. So that was my take on it. Overall, travel's safe, but certainly Boeing needs to get its act together.
Statistically, then, even though it might seem like, oh, there's this Boeing problem and there's that Boeing problem, they still have a ton of planes up in the air, and those planes are not having any trouble.
But I mean, that's the nature of transportation. Tell me another mode of transportation that's perfect. There is none. And that's why, I have so many friends who will ride to the airport in the back of an Uber without a seatbelt, and then they get scared to board the plane, which I think is just so fascinating that in our heads, we've built a narrative when in fact, you're on a plane with trained professionals. They check each other. They make sure they're sober. I mean, you go on the LIE in New York or 95 in Miami. Jesus, take the wheel. I mean, there are people on the road that probably haven't slept in days. So I'm clearly an advocate for flying, and I don't think people should be nervous necessarily. And it does appear that Boeing is in the process of a good overhauling of its leadership, and hopefully they put more engineers in positions of power, because I think that's really where they lost course. They were trying to cut corners, sort of the corporate side of let's just get things to market. We're so behind, stock prices going down. I'm getting pressure from all angles, and hopefully they put and listen to more engineers and certainly protect the whistleblowers who seem to be dropping like flies. But I guess that's a story for another podcast.
I mean, if you're prone to conspiracy theories, there is a Boeing whistleblower who committed suicide. So you just.
One had a random, MRSA infection that took him out in 24 hours. That was an interesting one. And, this isn't just the 737 MAX 9. Boeing has had these issues. A couple years ago, there was a New York Times expose on their Charleston factory with the 787 production, wires that were not done correctly. So it definitely seems like there are more issues with Boeing than Airbus. That being said, as consumers, like if you're only going to fly Airbus in the US, you're going to dramatically have to change your patterns. And who really, at the end of the day, most consumers care about money first, money and time, right? Like you're not going to double connect to get to your location to fly, Embraer or, Airbus aircraft. That would be silly. I don't know a single person who would add hours of their life and more flights for a infinitesimal safety increase.
Air travel is at really high levels. Do you have an understanding or an explanation about why we're at these record levels?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is fares have dropped. In 2022, we saw this insane spike. Month over month, 20% increases in airfare. I remember trying to go to a last minute trip to Europe, and it was like $7,500 in business class to every major capital. There were no deals to be had. And so over the next 2 years, airlines have added tons of European capacity, which has resulted actually in fares coming down quite a bit. And when you peg to 2019 dollars, fares are cheaper today, even with record numbers of people traveling. I'm going to Europe. I got an award ticket for 50,000 Air France miles one way, business class. I'm going to Spain later this summer, first class on British Airways, $4,000. First. Those were triple 2 summers ago. It's a funny thing. A lot of people are traveling. There's a lot of capacity, and the airlines don't have the authority to just raise prices crazily. And consumers are getting used to these cheap prices, so they just won't book. And airlines basically need to get a body in a seat, or else it's catastrophic for their sales. So it's a great time for consumers. And I will say, even though airports are more packed today than they've ever been, the airports are running pretty smoothly, barring one-off meltdowns. But the TSA in general, like they're 2 summers ago, even last summer, there were meltdowns at Amsterdam. I remember 20,000 bags lost at Heathrow, huge lines, missing bag. Things are actually running pretty smoothly. It's a great time to be flying, in my opinion.
The volumes of travelers is at these record high numbers. So why are the airline businesses struggling as businesses?
They were actually making more money when they were, gouging customers at double the rates.
Even though the planes weren't as crowded then.
The planes are more full today, right? That's how we hit the 3 million passengers screened on TSA, but they're filled at cheaper fares. The airlines are still making money, but not bank. And also, I would say too, we don't have the full numbers about business travel, but fare pricing has completely changed versus pre-pandemic. First class, business class used to have this premium that, barring, JetBlue coming onto a route and kind of stabilizing fares, that the major airlines were just charging $7,000 business class pretty much across the board. So they were gouging last minute and business travelers. Now it's more leisure travelers. So more people are buying business class, which is where airlines make money in general, but not at the rates that they used to have. And once you get consumers used to buying $4,000 round trip business class pretty easily all summer long, it's a lot harder to all of a sudden move that up to $7,000 where you were, because consumers get locked in and then they'll say, well, I'm not going to go.
So individuals are paying for business class.
Yep.
It's not mostly businesses or even points.
Correct. That is the biggest trend that came out. So as the pandemic was hitting, most airlines were also launching premium economy. So consumers got used to easing into premium economy versus just the cheapest fare. Because during the pandemic, you did not want to be, jammed in like a sardine. And during the pandemic, flights in the beginning were really cheap. So consumers started to get a real good taste of the life in the front of the plane and realized, wait a minute, as economy has stagnated, economy hasn't changed really in 40 years. It's still a tiny seat. You might get free Wi-Fi if you're lucky, but economy sucks, but where the real innovation has happened is in the front of the plane. So, and most people know the feeling of once you start flying first class, it's really hard to go back. A decade ago, Delta was upgrading 80% of its first class domestic cabins to elite travelers, and 20% were paid. Now it's flipped. 80% are paying and only 20% are given to those upgrading.
It does seem like business class keeps getting better, coach keeps getting worse, and it's confusing because there's economy light and economy classic and economy. It's like there are all these categories.
Yeah, and it can be confusing to know what you're exactly buying. And I think consumers are realizing cheap is expensive. Like buying that cheapest fare doesn't make sense, especially for those travelers who want frequent flyer miles. The evolution of all the major frequent flyer programs now, they're not frequent flyer programs, they're frequent buyer programs. You got to spend, baby. The airlines don't care how many flights you take. Who cares? How much money are you spending? But yeah, there's definitely been these tectonic shifts in behavior and travel. Loyalty is still as important as ever. And the credit card industry is really still fueling the growth in revenue and profits with airlines. If the airlines didn't have their co-branded credit cards, they would be in a really bad spot.
They make more money on their cards than they make on their flights.
Yeah, I mean, people joke airlines are really flying banks these days. 1% of total U.S. GDP is put on a Delta Amex card, which is pretty incredible to think about. And think about it, it's brilliant business because every time you spend $1 at a grocery store, Delta's getting a cut of that.
The CrowdStrike network outages really hammered the airlines. Delta worse than others. My recollection is that in previous kinds of crises, Delta systems generally held up better than some of the other airlines.
Delta's sort of at the forefront of technology. United is also very good as well. It's sort of United and Delta have invested a lot. So it was very concerning to see this complete and utter meltdown. Delta had poor systems in place, did not have backups for their crew scheduling. So essentially for several days, their system that tracks, and think about it, I think they have 900 planes at all times pretty much flying globally, and multiple crew members who have different timeouts, right? I mean, it's an insane mathematical problem. They lost the computing power to decide all that. I think we're doing it manually. And that's just a math problem even the smartest mathematicians can't do in real time. You certainly scratch your head and think like, how was there not plans in place for this?
The other airlines had backup
Apparently,
systems?
well, and not every airline uses CrowdStrike, but certainly it was a mega failure and one that you cannot place on CrowdStrike. It was Delta's response to a vendor issue or lack thereof that caused their mistake.
I mean, it's interesting. Delta was so, I felt like during the pandemic, in some ways, ahead of other airlines,
Totally.
more, better communication, and they just kind of slipped here.
Consumers are so willing and love when companies can just own their mistake. When people had weddings canceled, people couldn't see sick family members stranded for days. You're putting consumers through hell. That's when you really need to have some humble leadership that first and foremost focuses on the suffering of your customers. It took Delta 4 days to even come out with their consumer policy. And I think that's so wrong because think about it, especially consumers who don't have a lot of money. You're with your family. You're supposed to go to Orlando, the big Disney trip of the year. You scrounged your money to get to do it. You're at the airport. Delay, cancel. The Department of Transportation says I'll get a refund. Great, but now I'm losing $2,000 in hotels, park tickets, etc. Do we fly on United at last minute at $500 a ticket for 5 people? In the end, Delta covered that, but not until I'm sure tons of people had to say, you know what, we're calling it quits when they could have just rebooked themselves. And I think that's really lousy. So this is where I hope we can educate the flyers like, hey, look, these meltdowns are going to continue happening. They happen every 6 months or so. Sometimes it's an airline. Sometimes, the FAA systems, someone uploaded a bug and they shut down the whole, US aviation system for a day. That was last year. So I just think we need clearer consumer guidelines when the airline goes wrong, that you're not having to wait in a 100-person line at a crowded airport with stressed out frontline employees who are essentially God in that situation, and they get to decide what happens to you.
Southwest is giving up this sort of seat yourself model. It feels like the end of an era or the end of what defines Southwest. I don't know, it's such a key part of their business model. What changed? I
mean, the lagging of their competitors is the straw that broke the open seating back. They're not doing this because they did market research and all of a sudden they realized that everyone wants, assigned seating. This is strictly a revenue play. Their model is a relic of a time that no longer exists, losing billions a year in seating fees. They also still give 2 free check bags, losing billions a year. Southwest for many years was the leader. They had the brand loyalty when airfares were higher, planes were fuller, less meltdowns. They got stuck with an $800 million fine for their fiasco in 2022. They also got dinged with the Boeing issues and delays of new aircraft. So they're struggling in a lot of different ways. So I think the culmination is we have to deliver to stockholders, and let's do it by monetizing what every other airline does. What remains to be seen is, will they still give away 2 free check bags?
You would think that with the airline's emphasis on higher margin tickets and higher margin products overall, that it would kind of open the way for new budget airlines. But that doesn't seem to be happening.
No, and that that low-cost carrier model is really, really tough. The ones that are doing well, Avelo, Breeze, they're serving these new markets at the big airlines. They're small potatoes. There's a lot of movement happening into the Rust Belt. There's people retiring into parts of the country that are not just Naples, Miami, Jacksonville. And some of these low-cost carriers are doing well serving those communities. Allegiant is a great example where they serve random airports on random flights, and the people who love it, it works. So, but I think the fact that our infrastructure in America, our airports are overcrowded, air traffic issues, there's also pilot shortages and aircraft shortages. And also the major airlines try to push you out. So they'll drop their prices to bleed you dry because they can do that a lot longer. And we see that happening. American Airlines is really trying to push out JSX, which is the semi-private airline that's starting to take market share in LA and Dallas. And you'll see the airlines start to really sue them in court and do whatever it takes to make sure that these low-cost competitors don't come in.
Earlier this year, we had the Jet Blue-Spirit merger blocked. What does that mean for the industry moving forward? What does it mean for JetBlue and Spirit?
It's not great for them because all the other airlines merged during more friendly times. And I see their point of view saying it is really hard for us each individually to operate at scale at the size we are when this country has already allowed the top 4 airlines to, I think it's over 80% market share. You really gain efficiencies of scale. When you merge, that's really how you become profitable in airlines. So basically, they tried to do it at the wrong time, wrong president. Now, do I think mergers are good for consumers? In general, no. I actually like JetBlue. I fly JetBlue Mint. I'll even fly JetBlue Economy at 6'7" because they have really spacious seats, free snacks, free Wi-Fi, free Dunkin' Donuts. It's a great airline. So what would have happened in that merger is all Spirit planes would have become more premium JetBlue planes, which when you think about the market for cheap, bare bones flights, it would have dried up. I see both sides of it, but in general, the more consolidation, the less cheap fares, it in general, I don't think is great for consumers.
Are there topics and issues beyond the airlines, travel related, that you most have your eye on right now?
Well, yeah, so clearly I'm the points guy, and I call the current age of travel, we're in now the platinum age of travel. Credit card points and loyalty, when you know how to play it, is incredibly lucrative. And we've had this boom in credit card and loyalty, and now more and more people are traveling, saving thousands of dollars using points. There's a piece of legislation called the Credit Card Competition Act, which was introduced last year, which people don't realize could fundamentally change travel and increase airfare and take away the ability to earn points, which now, it's like an American rite of passage. Everyone has their points credit card, their airlines. Essentially what the government's trying to do is, so say you have a Chase Sapphire Visa, you pay $550 a year, you get triple points, you get your lounge access, you're happy. The government, if this bill passes, is going to force you to have essentially a debit card network. The government is going to give the right to retailers to choose which network to run. So retailers are salivating at this bill because it would take billions of dollars in value and reduce processing fees. Consumers wouldn't get points or nearly as many, and it would put that into the bottom line. So basically, Bob, every time you went to use a credit card, you would need to negotiate, haggle, and argue. So if you're at a restaurant, you would say, you better put it on the Visa. Because the restaurant has the power. The retailer has the power to choose. And of course, they're going to choose what's in their best interest unless you negotiate. So every single time you use your credit card, you would have to negotiate to get the points that you want. So it's this law, and this is the one big thing that could, I think, cataclysmically impact travel. And the airlines, which make billions from their credit card co-brands, as we discussed, are going to lose billions of dollars. What do you think they're going to do? Oh, it's a shame. Let's just start losing money and keep flying planes at a loss. No. Fares will rise. So consumers are going to get hit from multiple angles.
No, it's so interesting as you talk about this, because I never really thought about that airline travel is basically being subsidized by credit cards.
1,000,000%. People go on trips solely because they have enough points. Great, my flights to Hawaii are paid for. We're going to Hawaii. If you dramatically reduce the amount of points and earning, it will reduce commerce, it will reduce employment and leisure centers.
Well, it reduces incentives for the airlines too, right? Like their business becomes different.
Correct. They're going to make the money elsewhere. trust, the government, dear government, they're like, we got the banks this time. I'm like, you don't understand how business works. They're going to make it up. They're going to figure out. And guess who's going to pay for it? Consumers.
You're highly passionate about
yes.
this. Can feel it. Before I let you go, best point tips for travelers right now?
I would say here are my top points hacks. So since the pandemic, almost every loyalty program has waived the cancellation fees on award tickets. So I use my points like an insurance policy. So when I was flying Delta during the meltdown, I had a backup reservation on United using points. So if my Delta flight didn't go out, it was there. And you get this, you can cancel your award tickets up until 1 second before departure. So if you've got a lot of points, I view my points as insurance policies. I don't buy travel insurance. That's the other tip. You want to have credit card transferable points. You don't want to just all have all Delta or American. You want to have Amex points, Chase, Bilt, Capital One. Those points allow you to transfer to a number of different partners. So when I'm sitting there at the airport and I see there's one flight on United on the other LA flight, I think mine's going to get canceled. Bam, I just make a points reservation. If my original flight goes out, cancel, and I get all my miles and cash back, 0 fees. That's what people don't realize. Like, you can use your points as insurance policies to make sure you're getting to where you go. And my other tip would say the US programs have increased the amount of miles you need for tickets. You look at Delta going to Europe, 375,000 miles each way, 750,000 miles for a business class ticket. That same flight, if you transferred Amex or Chase points to Air France, their partner, as low as 50,000 each way. So the deals are with foreign frequent flyer programs. Because once again, in France, they don't have 100,000 point offers, bonanzas like we do here. So we're seeing inflation in the amount of award tickets for US programs, but not nearly the amount for the foreign programs. Because if they did that in France, where their French members can't earn points like we do, there would be a riot.
Well, I got to get off because I got to go jump on and make some reservations.
I'm here to help.
Well, Brian, this has been great. Thanks for doing it.
Thanks so much for having me. Safe travels.